My name is Myra Enfield, and I ended 29 years of fake family smiles with just 2 words that I kept locked in my chest like a loaded gun. My mother showed up at my front door smelling like jasmine perfume and fresh lies, holding a Nordstrom bag, like a shield to hide the fact that she was 5 days too late. She asked to see my baby, her voice dripping with that fake warmth she saves for church fundraisers and country club brunches. I looked at her pearl earrings, her fresh manicure, and the smile she uses to manipulate everyone in her orbit. Then I said 2 words that shattered the silence I had been carrying since I was 10 years old. "What baby?" She stared at me like I had lost my mind, but the truth is, I had finally found it. If you love watching entitled families get destroyed by their own greed and silence, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Payback Vault. Because trust me, you do not want to miss the christening scene where I burned it all down. Let me take you back 5 days before that door slam, back to the night when the Enfield family showed their true colors in high definition. I was 39 weeks pregnant, swollen, like a beach ball, and exhausted from carrying a human being while carrying my family's emotional baggage at the same time. My family, the rich, colonial house-having, 2 Lexus in the driveway Enfields, decided that my labor was less important than a fancy charcuterie board and a $5 million investor dinner. While I was timing my contractions on my phone in the hallway, they were timing the wine service for 16 guests who didn't even know my name. You think I'm joking? My own mother, Judith Enfield, was more worried about the napkin folds matching the tablecloth than she was about her grandchild's arrival into this world. That night taught me a lesson that 32 years of therapy could not have prepared me for. Blood does not make family, and silence is just complicity wearing a polite smile. I grew up in Westbrook, Connecticut, in a 4-bedroom colonial with an in-ground pool and a mother who treated me like the spare part in the family display case. My sister Victoria was the golden child. Blonde curls, big smile, easy laugh, the kind of daughter you introduce first at every single event. I was the structural engineer, the quiet one who held the ladder while Victoria took the spotlight, the one who fixed the broken things but never got credit for keeping the house from collapsing. My father, Gerald, gave me a silver bracelet when I was 10 years old, and he said something I have replayed in my head 1,000 times since. "This one's just for you." I wore that bracelet for 22 years, through high school, through college, through every dinner where my mother forgot to set a place card for me. I thought that bracelet was love, but looking back now, I realize it was just guilt wrapped in metal and polished to look like affection. Let me paint you a picture of the Enfield household, because unless you have lived it, you cannot understand how surgical their cruelty really was. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, precise, and devastating, like a scalpel instead of a hammer. My mother would introduce Victoria to guests first, every single time, with a proud smile that could light up a room. "This is my daughter Victoria. She runs our communications, and she is absolutely brilliant." Then, only if someone specifically asked about the other daughter, she would add, "Oh, and that's Myra. She does engineering somewhere in Hartford." Like I was a plumber who had accidentally crashed the country club party. I did not notice this pattern for years because I thought that was just how families worked. The pretty one gets the spotlight, and the quiet one holds the ladder. But then Nathan's mother, Dolores, asked me one question on a drive home from Thanksgiving dinner, and that question shattered the glass I had been staring through my entire life. Dolores Reeves is a retired school nurse with zero tolerance for nonsense and a heart the size of a dump truck, and she saw through my family in 3 hours flat. She sat through a Thanksgiving dinner where Judith spent 3 hours bragging about Victoria's charity gala, Victoria's engagement, Victoria's everything, while I sat at the end of the table carving the turkey I had brought myself. On the drive home, with the headlights cutting through the Connecticut dark, Dolores turned to me in the back seat and asked a question that stopped my heart. "Honey," she said, her voice soft but sharp as a tack, Does your mother always introduce Victoria first? I opened my mouth to defend them, to make an excuse, to say something that would protect the fantasy I had been living in. But nothing came out. That silence? That was the answer I had been avoiding for 29 years. That was the moment I realized I had been erased so slowly and so carefully that I did not even feel the pencil moving across my skin. Fast forward to the engagement party from hell, which was really just a preview of the horror show that was about to unfold 3 weeks later. Victoria was engaged to a smooth-talking businessman named Derek Blaine, a guy with a fake Rolex, a real ego, and a spreadsheet of investors he was desperate to impress. Judith hired a string quartet, 2 bartenders, and a caterer who charged more for the shrimp than most people spend on rent. I was 36 weeks pregnant, waddling like a penguin, and my invitation came with a job description attached like a chain to a prison cell. "Can you come early to help set up?" Victoria texted me. "And maybe don't wear anything too casual because there will be investors." I showed up anyway because that is what I did. I showed up, I folded napkins into shapes I learned from a YouTube video at midnight, and I carried chairs while my sister posed for photos. When the guests arrived, my mother positioned herself at the front door like a bouncer at an exclusive club, and she introduced Victoria 14 times. Not once did she say my name. Not once. Then Derek found me by the bar, leaning against the Z counter with a glass of bourbon he was using more as a prop than a drink. He smiled that salesman's smile. Wide, practiced, aimed directly at my weak spots like a heat-seeking missile. "So, Myra," he said, swirling the bourbon like he was in a movie. "Victoria tells me you're a structural engineer. Interesting." Then, he dropped the bomb. "I was looking into your father's company records. That Harrove contract that saved the whole operation, Victoria told me she set that up." I did not blink, did not flinch, did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But Derek was smarter than my family gave him credit for, because he leaned in closer and said, "But my buddy at Harrove mentioned an Enfield woman, an engineer. He said she made the introduction. That wasn't Victoria, was it?" I picked up my water glass and said, "You should ask Victoria." He laughed, short, clipped, like a receipt printing out of a machine, and walked away. He knew the truth. He was measuring me, not to help me, but to figure out if I was useful to him. That was the moment I realized the game was rigged from the start. The toast came at 8 o'clock, and it was the moment I finally stopped pretending that I mattered to these people. Judith stood before 30 guests with a champagne flute raised, like a trophy, and she spoke for 3 full minutes about Victoria, her daughter, her pride, her joy, her everything. She used the phrase "our daughter" 5 times, and each repetition landed on my chest like a small stone being added to a pile I had been carrying since childhood. She did not say my name. She did not look at me. She did not acknowledge that. I was sitting at the end of the table, pregnant with her granddaughter, invisible as the wallpaper. At the end of the toast, a guest asked Judith, "Where's the rest of the family?" And my mother tilted her head, smiled that razor blade smile, and said something I will carry to my grave. "We can only afford 1 daughter tonight." The room laughed. Light, social, forgettable to everyone but me. Nathan had arrived 10 minutes earlier, still in his firefighter uniform, and I felt his hand on my elbow like a lifeline. He whispered, "Say the word." I shook my head. Not here. Not now. But I was already bleeding inside. 3 weeks passed, and the baby had dropped, and I was waddling through those final days like a ship taking on water before a storm. Gerald called me on a Tuesday. He never called on Tuesdays, and he told me that my mother was hosting an investor dinner that Saturday. 16 guests, a $5 million potential deal with the Patterson Group. The biggest contract Enfield and Associates had ever chased. Your mother just needs the evening to go smoothly, Gerald said, his voice flat and tired, like a man reading lines from a script he did not write. She was wondering if you could come by early and help manage the seating. I was 39 weeks pregnant, due in 4 days, and my father was asking me to arrange place cards for people who would not even notice I was there. I said, I can't promise I'll be there, Dad. He said, I understand, but he did not understand anything except Judith's moods and how to survive them. I hung up and called Nathan at the fire station, and he told me his chief had already said he could leave early if I needed him. A fire chief I had met twice said family first, faster than my own parents ever had. Saturday came like a slow-motion car crash, and I drove myself to that house against every instinct screaming in my body. The Enfield house was transformed into a magazine spread. 16 place settings, linen napkins, candles from the Christmas catalog, a catering van out back with 2 servers in black aprons. I arrived at 4 o'clock, and Judith met me in the kitchen without a hello, without a how are you feeling, without anything resembling human warmth. She scanned my body, swollen, ankles, plain navy dress, hair pulled back, and said, You look tired. Maybe sit in the back for dinner. I checked the place cards in the dining room, and there were 16 names lined up like soldiers. Mine was not among them. I walked back to my mother and said, Mom, there's no card for me. She barely looked, up from the flower arrangement she was obsessing over. Oh, we ran out of the ivory ones. Just pull up a chair near the kitchen. You'll be more comfortable there anyway. Near the kitchen, where the servers worked, where the help sat. I set the cards with shaking hands as a contraction tightened across my lower back like a fist. 6 seconds. Mild. I breathed through it and told myself I was fine. I was not fine, but I was still pretending. 9:15 p.m. The guests were eating salad, laughing at Derek's boring anecdotes about sailing, and pretending the world outside their bubble did not exist. The third contraction hit me like a freight train, harder than the first 2, deeper, more insistent. I gripped the edge of the table under the cloth so no one would see my knuckles going white. 7 minutes since the last one. They were getting closer, getting stronger, getting real. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor, and walked to the living room where Judith was holding court with 3 investors' wives. She had a champagne flute in her right hand and a framed photo of Victoria on the mantel behind her. I touched her elbow and said, Mom, can I talk to you for a second? She followed me to the hallway, but she kept one eye on the living room the whole time, like I was interrupting a business meeting. Mom, I said, my voice shaking, I think I'm in labor. The contractions are 9 minutes apart. I need someone to drive me to the hospital. Judith looked at me. Then she looked back at the living room. Then she looked at me again, and her face went flat. Myra, not now. We're in the middle of something. Where's your husband? I told her Nathan was 40 minutes out. She straightened her necklace, a nervous habit she had when she was annoyed, and said, Then wait. You're probably overreacting. First babies take forever. Sit down. Have some water. Another contraction ripped through me while I stood in that hallway, and I grabbed the side table to keep from falling over. A vase of white lilies trembled, and a few drops of water sloshed onto the marble floor. Judith watched it happen. She watched her 39-week pregnant daughter brace herself against a table during a contraction, and she did not move an inch. She did not reach out her hand. She did not call for help. She just stood there with her champagne flute and her fresh manicure and her jasmine perfume, waiting for me to stop inconveniencing her evening. I straightened up and looked at her face, and in that moment I understood something I had been refusing to see for 29 years. She was not going to help me. Not in 40 minutes. Not in 40 years. I walked to the dining room where Gerald was pouring Bordeaux for Victor Patterson, and I said, Dad, I need to go to the hospital now. He looked at me, then at Judith, who had followed me in. Judith gave a small shake of her head, almost invisible, but I caught it because I had been reading that signal my entire life. Gerald cleared his throat and said, "Honey, can it wait an hour? We're right in the middle of the Patterson deal." And then my mother said the words that will echo in my skull until the day I die. She said them softly, without looking up from the napkin she was refolding. "Call a cab, Myra. We're busy." The dining room held 16 people, and not one of them looked at me as I turned and walked toward the front door. The servers kept moving. The candles kept burning. The jasmine perfume hung in the air like a lie that had been repeated so many times it had become the truth. I picked up my car, keys from the hallway table. I walked to the front door. The string quartet had packed up an hour ago, so the only sound was my shoes on the marble floor. Click, 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 like a countdown to something I could not name. Nobody followed me. Nobody called my name. Nobody said, "Wait, let me drive." You. I opened the door, stepped into the cold October air, and pulled it shut behind me. The latch clicked, and that click was the last sound I ever made in my parents' house. I stood in the driveway for a moment, staring at the porch light that my mother had turned on for her guests. Not for me, never for me. And then I got into my Honda with shaking hands and drove myself to the hospital. 18 minutes of hell, red lights, contractions, and a phone that did not ring once from anyone with the last name Enfield. A nurse named Colleen met me at the emergency entrance, and she took one look at my face, pale, sweating, alone, and did not ask a single stupid question. "Where's your support person?" she asked, grabbing my arm and walking me inside. "He's coming," I said. "Who dropped you off?" she asked. "I drove," I said. She looked at me, 39 weeks, soaking wet with sweat, holding my own belly through a contraction, and her face softened into something that looked like pain. She wrote in my chart, "Patient arrived alone, self-transported, no emergency contact present at admission." I saw those words before she closed the folder, and they hit me harder than any contraction ever could. Nathan burst through the door at 10:35 p.m., still in his boots, his collar unbuttoned, his eyes wild with fear. He grabbed my hand and said, "I'm here." 2 words, the right ones. Eloise Reeves was born at 3:17 in the morning, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a full head of dark hair. I held her on my chest, skin to skin, and I did not check my phone. I did not need to. I already knew there were 0 calls from the Enfield family. While I was lying in that hospital bed, bleeding and exhausted and holding my newborn daughter, my family was posting about their perfect evening on Instagram. I saw the notification on my phone when I finally looked at it at 5 in the morning, the Enfield family group chat that Victoria had accidentally re-added me to. At 9:42 p.m., while I was driving myself to the hospital, Victoria texted, "OMG, Myra just made a scene about going to the hospital." At 9:44 p.m., Judith responded, "I told her to call a cab. She's always dramatic." At 9:45 p.m., Derek chimed in, "Patterson almost walked out. Control your daughter, Gerald." And then my father, the man who gave me a silver bracelet when I was 10 and told me it was just for me, typed 3 words at 9:47 p.m. "She left. It's handled." She left. It's handled. That was my father's response to his daughter driving herself to the hospital in active labor. I looked at that screen and something inside me shifted. Not with anger, not with sadness, but with clarity. I unclasped the silver bracelet from my wrist for the first time in 22 years, and I set it on the hospital bedside table. I was done waiting for people who would never come. 5 days passed. 5 days of silence from the Enfield family. No flowers, no texts, no phone calls. Just Victoria posting "best night ever" on Instagram with a photo of a chandelier and a gold filter. Then my mother showed up at my front door on a Thursday afternoon, smelling like jasmine perfume and carrying a Nordstrom bag like a peace offering wrapped in pink tissue paper. She was wearing a cream blazer and gold earrings, her hair freshly blown out, her lipstick precise as a scalpel. She looked like she was arriving at a charity luncheon, not meeting her granddaughter for the first time. "Surprise," she said, holding up the bag. "I came to see the baby." I stood in the doorway, and I did not step aside. I did not invite her in. I looked at her. The jasmine, the blazer, the gift bag delivered 5 days too late. And I felt something I had never felt before in her presence. Power. I looked at my mother, the woman who had introduced Victoria first for 29 years, and I said the 2 words that ended everything. "What baby?" Her face went blank, then confused, then angry. "What do you mean, what baby?" I said. "You didn't have a granddaughter on Saturday night. You didn't have one on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. So what baby are you here to see?" Then I closed the door in her face. Not hard, not soft, just closed. The latch clicked, and for the first time in my life, that click sounded like freedom. Judith did not accept rejection gracefully. She never had, and she never would. Instead, she repackaged it into a weapon and turned it against me with the precision of a surgeon who had been practicing on my heart for decades. Within a week, she had called every relative in our family and told them a story that was carefully crafted to make her the victim and me the villain. "Myra is struggling with postpartum depression," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "She won't let me see my own grandchild. I'm so worried about her." It was genius, honestly, the kind of manipulation that only a true narcissist can pull off without breaking a sweat. She flipped the script completely, turning me from a daughter setting necessary boundaries into a sick woman keeping a heartbroken grandmother away from her innocent grandchild. The calls started on a Monday, and by Wednesday I had received 11 messages from aunts, uncles, and church ladies. "Your mother is heartbroken, Myra. She just wants to hold the baby. Is that so terrible?" 2 women from Judith's church group sent flowers with a card that said, "Praying for your family's healing." I did not yell. I did not cry. I answered every single call with the same sentence, repeated like a mantra. "Ask her what happened at 9:15 on a Saturday night." That timestamp was my sword, and I did not need to swing it. I just held it up and let the truth do the work. 2 weeks after I closed the door on my mother, my father showed up at my house alone. No Judith, no Victoria, no warning. His Lincoln was in my driveway at noon on a Tuesday, and his knock was so soft that I almost missed it over the sound of Eloise cooing in her bassinet. I opened the door, and Gerald Enfield looked like he had aged 10 years in 14 days. Wrinkled button-down shirt, stubble on his jaw. Gerald Enfield never had stubble. And eyes that were bloodshot from something other than drinking. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Just me?" I let him in, and I do not know why. Maybe because the last time I heard that tone in his voice, that desperate, cracking tone, was the night he called me about the $1.2 million debt. Gerald only sounded honest when he was desperate, and right now, he looked like a man who had run out of lies to hide behind. He sat on my couch and stared at Eloise in her bassinet for a long time, a full minute of silence while I stood by the window waiting. "She's beautiful," he finally said. I said, "I know." Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the silver bracelet, the one I had hidden in a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet. "I found this when I came to check on the house," he said, setting it on the coffee table. He had been in my house while I was in the hospital. He had gone into my closet and found the one thing I had tried to put away. I looked at that bracelet. 22 years of scratches, 22 years of hoping, and I felt nothing. Gerald sat on my couch with the silver bracelet between us like a dead thing we were both too afraid to bury. "I remember giving you this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember too," I said, and my voice was not warm. It was not cold either, just tired, like a door that had been slammed too many times and no longer swung right. He did not apologize. He did not promise to change. He did not say he would stand up to Judith or defend me at the next family dinner. He just sat there, a man who had chosen peace over his own daughter for 29 years. And then he stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the door. He left the bracelet on my coffee table. I picked it up after he was gone, held it under the lamp, and looked at the engraving that had almost completely faded away. Myra. That was my name. That was the proof that at some point, in some version of reality that no longer existed, my father had seen me. I put the bracelet in a small jewelry box with a card I had written that morning. "Dad, I kept this for 22 years. I don't need it anymore, but you should remember who you were when you gave it to me." I put the box in the closet, but this time, I did not hide it. I just set it on the shelf and closed the door. Nathan found my driving shoes, the brown leather, flats I had worn to the hospital, while he was reorganizing the hall closet on a Saturday morning. He sat on the bottom step of the staircase and held them in both hands, staring at the dried mud from the hospital parking lot and the dark scuff on the left toe where I had hit the brake too hard during a contraction. He did not speak for 2 full minutes, and I stood in the hallway watching him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You drove 18 minutes in labor in these," he said. It was not a question. "Nathan," I started, but he cut me off. "I'm not letting this go, Myra. I know you want to handle it quiet. That's who you are, and I respect it. But my family doesn't work that way, and our daughter is not going to grow up wondering why Grandma Judith gets a free pass." He called Dolores that afternoon, and I listened from the kitchen as he laid out the plan. "Mom, we're doing the christening at Grace Community, our church, our family, and if the Enfields want to come, they get an invitation, not a seat at the table." Dolores's voice came through the phone, clear as Sunday morning. "You don't owe anyone the right to hurt your child. Remember that." Nathan hung up and looked at me. "Pastor Williams already knows the situation. Front pew is reserved for family only." I asked him, "What counts as family?" He picked up my brown shoes, held them gently like they were evidence, and said, "The people who show up." 3 days before the christening, an email landed in my inbox that blew the whole Enfield empire to smithereens. The sender was Margaret Patterson, the investor's wife in the pale blue jacket who had asked me about the Harrove contract at the engagement party. The subject line read, "Something you should know." I opened it while Eloise was chewing on a teething ring in her bouncer, and my hands started shaking before I even finished the first sentence. "Dear Myra," Margaret wrote, "I wanted you to know that we have pulled out of the Enfield deal. After our conversation at the dinner, I did some research. The Harrove introduction, that was yours, wasn't it? Dan Whitfield confirmed it. I don't do business with people who erase their own family." Below the message, she had attached 3 documents. Public records showing that Derek Blaine had 2 prior fraud complaints filed against him in Rhode Island, and that his real estate license in that state had been suspended 18 months ago. She had dug this up on her own, without me asking, without me hinting, without me doing anything except telling the truth in a hallway at a dinner party. I forwarded the email to Gerald with no message, no commentary, just the facts. Then I closed my laptop and waited for the bomb to go off. The bomb went off at 7 the next morning, and it sounded exactly like my mother screaming through the phone. Gerald called first, 7 a.m., which meant he had been up all night or Judith had been up all night, and neither option was good. "The Patterson deal is dead," he said, his voice hollow, like a man who had just watched his whole life collapse in slow motion. $5 million. Gone. Derek's license is suspended. There's some complaint in Rhode Island. Did you know about this? I said, "I forwarded you the email." Then my mother ripped the phone out of Gerald's hand. I could hear the scuffle, the sharp intake of breath, the door slamming in the background. "You ruined this family!" Judith screamed, her voice cracking in a way I had never heard before. "You have always been the ungrateful one, after everything we've done for you." I cut her off and my voice was level. Not cold, not hot, just done. "What have you done for me, Mom? Name one thing. I'll wait." 3 seconds of silence. Then she said, "I gave you a home." I said, "You gave me an address. Dolores gave me a home." Judith inhaled sharply, a wet, ragged sound, the sound of someone who has never been answered back and does not know what to do with it. "You'll regret this, Myra," she whispered. "Mark my words." I said, "Maybe. But I won't regret driving myself to the hospital to have your granddaughter while you poured wine for strangers. That one is yours to carry." Then I hung up. Sunday. Morning, 10 a.m. Grace Community Church sat on a hill at the edge of town, white-clappered, stained-glass windows, and a bell tower that hadn't worked in 20 years, but still looked the part. Inside, the November sun came through the colored glass in gold and red and blue, falling on wooden pews and fresh flower arrangements that Dolores had set out at 7 in the morning. I wore a white blouse with my hair pulled back, and for the first time in 22 years, my left wrist was bare. No bracelet, no scars, just skin that was finally learning to breathe. Eloise wore a christening gown of ivory cotton with hand-stitched lace at the hem, a gown that Dolores had spent 3 weeks sewing because every baby in the Reeves family wears something she makes. The front pew was reserved for Nathan, me, Dolores, Nathan's brother Kevin and his wife Stacy, and Nathan's Aunt Ruth. The third pew held Nurse Colleen in a green dress, and the fifth pew held 4 colleagues from my engineering firm and 2 firefighters from Station 12. At 10:05, the main door opened and heels clicked on hardwood, a sound I had been hearing my entire life, a sound that usually meant trouble with a capital T. Judith Enfield walked in carrying a bouquet of white roses and wearing a pastel blue dress that probably cost more than my first car. Behind her came a photographer with a camera around his neck. Behind him came Victoria, eyes already swollen, mascara already smudged. Gerald came last, gray suit, tight jaw, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Judith walked straight toward the front pew, her heels clicking like gunshots in the quiet church, the white roses held in front of her like a scepter or a shield. Nathan stood up before she could take another step, 6 feet of firefighter in. A dark suit, his voice low and even, the same voice he used when he was walking into burning buildings. "Third row from the back, Mrs. Enfield. Those are your seats." Judith stopped mid-stride, her mouth opening and closing like a fish that had been thrown onto a dock. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice rising into that high-pitched register she used when she was not getting her way. Nathan did not move. "You heard me. 3rd row." Gerald grabbed Judith's arm, a rare moment of physical intervention from a man who usually just stood there and let the storm pass over him. "Judith, let's just sit down." Victoria was already pulling her mother toward the 3rd row, whispering something about making a scene, but Judith was not listening. She sat down hard, the roses crushed against her chest, her eyes fixed on the wall. Front pew like she was calculating her next move. Pastor Williams began the ceremony, his voice warm and unhurried. "We are gathered to welcome Eloise Margaret Reeves into this community of faith and love." He looked at Nathan and me. "Who presents this child?" Nathan said. "We do." Dolores stood up. "Her family does." No Enfield was asked. No Enfield stood. The ceremony continued. Scripture, a hymn, prayers that floated up toward the ceiling like smoke. And then Pastor Williams asked the question that broke everything open. Who will guide this child in love and truth? Nathan stood. Dolores stood. Kevin and Stacy stood. Aunt Ruth stood. 4 people. None of them blood-related to me in the way that mattered on paper, all of them more family than the Enfields had ever been. Judith watched from the 3rd row, her face cycling through emotions like a slot machine: shock, fury, disbelief, and finally, a rage so hot I could feel it from across the room. She could not take it. She rose to her feet so fast that her chair scraped the floor with a sound that cut through the hymn like a knife through silk. "I am her grandmother," Judith's voice carried to every corner of the church, bouncing off. The stained glass and the wooden rafters and the shocked faces of 62 guests. "I should be up there. This is my granddaughter." The organist stopped mid-chord. The congregation froze. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of Judith's expensive dress and the ragged edge of her breathing. I turned slowly, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, and I found my mother's face in the back row. Mascara running down her cheeks, lips trembling, white roses crushed against her chest like a prop she had forgotten how to use. I did not raise my voice. I did not step forward. I stayed exactly where I was, Eloise in my arms, and I said 2 words that landed like a hammer, on glass. "Sit down, Mom." Judith's mouth opened. "Don't you dare." Nathan's voice came from beside me, low and even, the voice he uses in burning buildings when he's telling people to get out. "Ma'am, please sit down." Judith sat. Her hands were shaking. The photographer lowered his camera. He had not taken a single shot. The ceremony continued, but everyone in that room knew something had shifted, something that could not be put back together. The fellowship hall after the ceremony smelled like coffee, lemon pound cake, and the faint, metallic tang of adrenaline that comes after a public explosion. Dolores had baked 3 cakes. Kevin's wife brought cookies shaped like ducks, and someone from the fire station brought a banner that said, "Welcome, Eloise," in big blue letters. People hugged me, shook Nathan's hand, held the baby, and said, things like, "She's got your eyes," and "Hold on to this age, it goes fast." I was pouring coffee when the jasmine hit me for the last time. That familiar, cloying scent that had been following me around like a ghost since I was old enough to recognize manipulation. Judith stood 3 feet away, her mascara now streaked. Beyond repair, but her hair still perfect because nothing shook Judith Enfield's hair. Her voice was low and shaking, caught somewhere between grief and fury, like a wire that had been pulled too tight and was about to snap. "How could you humiliate me like that in front of strangers?" she hissed, her eyes darting around the room to see who was watching. I set the coffee pot down on the table and turned to face her. "Strangers?" I said, my voice calm and clear, the voice I use in engineering reviews when I am presenting facts that cannot be disputed. These people were in the delivery room. These people brought soup at 6 in the morning. These people answered their phones at 9:15 on a Saturday night. "Who are the strangers here, Mom?" Gerald appeared at Judith's shoulder like a man who had been summoned by a bell he could not hear, his face gray and haggard in the fellowship hall light. "Myra, your mother made a mistake," he said, reaching for the same excuse he had been using for 29 years. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the ghost of the man who had sat on the edge of my bed when I was 10 years old and given me a silver bracelet. That man was gone, buried under years of silence and complicity and the desperate need to keep the peace at any cost. "A mistake is forgetting a birthday, Dad," I said, my voice not rising, not falling, just stating facts like they were engineering specifications. "Choosing a dinner over your daughter's labor is a decision, and I am allowed to make my own decisions based on that one." Victoria stepped forward, her eyes red and her voice cracking like a teenager's. "You're tearing this family apart," she cried, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "This family was apart," I said, looking at the 3 of them standing together like the last survivors of a shipwreck. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't." The room had gone quiet, 62 people holding coffee cups and cookies, watching, The Enfield dynasty crumble in real time. I reached into Nathan's jacket pocket and pulled out the small black jewelry box. I held it out to Gerald. Dad, I kept this for 22 years. I don't need it anymore, but you should remember who you were when you gave it to me. He took the box with trembling fingers and opened it. The silver bracelet caught the overhead light. Scratched, thin, the engraving almost gone. He read the card. I watched his eyes move across the words I had written. He closed the box and looked at Judith. "Let's go," he said. Judith looked at Gerald like he had just slapped her in front of the entire congregation. "Gerald, say something," she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. My father, the man who had spent 29 years avoiding conflict, avoiding truth, avoiding his own daughter, took a breath and said the same 3 words he had typed into a group chat at 9:47 on a Saturday night. "She left. It's handled." Then he walked to the door. Judith followed him, her heels clicking on the hardwood like the final beats of a dying heart. Victoria followed, her mascara now a complete disaster, her engagement ring catching the light as she wiped her eyes. The photographer packed up his camera. He had not taken a single photograph of the baby, not one, because the only drama he had captured was not the kind anyone wanted to remember. The white roses that Judith had brought sat on a back pew, abandoned, the petals already browning at the edges, the ribbon coming loose. The door closed behind the 3 of them with a soft click, softer than the one at my front door, but just as final. The church exhaled. Dolores walked over to me and took my hand without saying a word, because she never said much when it mattered most. She just showed up, and that was enough. "You don't owe anyone the right to hurt your child," she said quietly. "Remember that." Pastor Williams placed a hand on Eloise's head. The baby had slept through the entire thing, as if she already knew that the hard part was over. "Some families start at birth," he said. "Some start when you choose to show up." 2 months later, the dominoes fell faster than anyone could have predicted, and the Enfield empire crumbled like a house of cards left out in the rain. Margaret Patterson's withdrawal from the deal triggered a chain reaction that no one saw coming. Without that $5 million, Derek's involvement came under scrutiny, and Gerald's accountant started pulling records like a detective at a crime scene. The 2 prior fraud complaints in Rhode Island surfaced, both involving misrepresented property values and both carrying the distinct scent of a man who had been running a con for years. Victoria ended the engagement in December. She showed up at our parents' house on a Tuesday, dropped the ring on the kitchen counter, and drove away in the BMW that Derek was still making payments on. But Derek was not the only problem, because Gerald had signed a personal guarantee on an $800,000 line of credit that Derek had arranged through a development firm in Stamford. When the deal collapsed, the firm called the note, and Gerald could not cover it. Enfield and Associates lost 2 major contracts in January. Clients cited reputational concerns in letters that were polite but brutal. The company that I had saved 4 years ago, the one I had pulled, back from the brink of bankruptcy with a single phone call to Harrove, began to fold for the second time. This time, there was no one to call. Judith was quietly asked to step down from the church fundraising board. "Personal matters," they said in the announcement that appeared in the church bulletin the following Sunday. She resigned from the country club the same week, sending a BAF letter that was polite and cold and full of the same fake grace she had used her entire life to cover up the rot underneath. 2 pillars of the Judith Enfield brand, gone in 7 days. The church board and the country club membership, the 2 things that had defined her existence for 30 years. Victoria called me in February, the first time since the christening, her voice small and hollow in a way I had never heard before. "Derek is gone," she said. "Mom and Dad might lose the house. Can you help?" I was holding Eloise in my arms. looking out the window at the bare November trees along Route 9, and I thought about that hallway, that cab, that silence. "I'm sorry about Derek," I said, and I meant it. No one deserved to be lied to like that. But I can't fix what I didn't break. Gerald filed Chapter 11 in March. The Colonial in Westbrook went on the market. 4 bedrooms, in-ground pool, 2-car garage, asking price $640,000. I read the listing online and recognized the kitchen where I had folded napkins into shapes for people who could not be bothered to learn my name. I did not feel revenge. I did not feel relief. I felt tired. I looked at my daughter, sleeping peacefully in her sage green nursery, and I closed my laptop. I put on the new brown leather shoes that Nathan had bought me, good soles, new ground, and I went for a walk. I used to think that family meant staying through the silence, through the humiliation, through the Saturday nights when nobody came to pick you up from the hospital. I used to think that if I just tried harder, just folded more napkins, just made more phone calls, just saved more companies, that eventually they would see me. Eventually they would introduce me. First, eventually they would choose me over a dinner party. But now I know the truth, and the truth is simple and brutal and liberating all at once. Family does not mean staying. Family means showing up. And some people just do not show up. They do not show up to the hospital. They do not show up to the christening. They do not show up to the birthdays or the graduations or the moments that actually matter. They only show up when they need something. A napkin folder, a company saver, a scapegoat to blame when their own choices come back to haunt them. My daughter will never know that version of family. She will know Dolores's Sunday phone calls and her hand-stitched christening gowns. She will know Nathan's calm voice and his grilled cheese sandwiches on nights when the world gets heavy. She will know that if she ever has to drive herself to the hospital, I will be in the car behind her before she hits the first red light. That is the legacy I am building now. Not a bracelet, not a colonial house, not a country club membership. Just showing up. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know that silence hits harder than shouting, and that the quietest people are often carrying the heaviest loads. If you have ever been the one nobody came for, the one who drove themselves to the hospital, the one who sat at the end of the table while everyone else got introduced, the one who was told to call a cab when you needed a ride, then drop a comment below with 3 numbers, 9:15 p.m. Let me see those timestamps in the comments. Let me see how many of us have been told we are too dramatic, or too sensitive, or too much, when all we were asking for was the bare minimum. If you want more stories about boundaries, about revenge, about walking away from tables that have no place settings for you, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell for the Payback Vault. Because the best revenge is not anger, and it is not hate, and it is not screaming into the void. The best revenge is living well with the front door locked and the back door open to the people who actually showed up. I am Myra Enfield, and this was my story. See you in the next one.